Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Bava Kamma Daf Yud Gimel. We are going to get started with a review of the previous sugya. It's a little bit complicated, and I want to make it a little bit more clear than yesterday. So we ended our sugya yesterday with this idea of nichasim she'ein behem meila. So we're going to see a different interpretation of it later today, but right now Rabbi Yochanan says nichasim she'ein behem meila means possessions that have no laws of meila, which would then exclude what? Now, again, if it doesn't have meila, then you're not liable for damages, which basically means koshei, kodshim. But if it's kodshim kalim, which we're going to see today what a bunch of examples are, but we already saw shlamim and bechor. Okay, today we'll see also maaser behema, the 10th of your animal that you bring has to be brought as a sacrifice. It's considered light kodashim, would be considered mamon ba'alim. Therefore, the Mishna masna, because it uses the language doesn't have meila, meaning there's no obligation if you misuse the consecrated property. So that's a good example. That's kodshim kalim. There is no laws of meila. Okay. Now, at least regarding the meat. Okay. There is for the imurim, but that's something else. So the meat of, right, if your animal does this, it's considered your possession, which means it's shorei, which means you'll be liable for damages. So let's just go very quickly through what we did yesterday. So I brought it in the study guide for today. Also, we had a contradiction between Rabbi Yosi Aglili and a Mishna. The Mishna said that if you're mekadesh from your part, whether it's kodshim kalim or kodshim, a man betroths a woman, she's not mekudeshet. That seems to imply it's not your own money to play with. So the first answer is very simply, okay, that Mishnah doesn't follow Rabbi Yosi Aglili. Very simple. Rabbi Yosi Aglili thinks it's mamon, your own mamon, and this other opinion thinks it's mamon gavoa, it belongs to God. But the second answer, and that's the one that interests us, we suggested that maybe Rabbi Yosi Aglili doesn't think like we thought, that all koshei kalim forever are always considered the mamon of the person. But no, there's a timeline. When does it become sanctified? When I decide this animal is going to be brought as a shlem. At that point, that's what we call mechayim. At that point, when it's still alive, before I've slaughtered it, it's considered my own. Once I slaughter it, now what happens when I slaughter it? Well, then parts get burnt on the altar. Most of it I get to eat. So you would think that's what Rabbi Yosi Aglili is saying, it belongs to me because I get to eat it. No. At that stage, even though I can eat it, that's when the Mishnah says you can't betroth a woman with that. Why? Even though I can eat it, the man can't take that meat, say, I'm betrothing a woman with this meat. Why? Because perhaps, and this is the second answer, Rabbi Yosi Aglili thinks that once you slaughter it, it becomes sanctified. So it's true that you get to eat it, but that's because God is allowing you to eat from his portion. That was the main thing that got us off on our question, which is, again, I want to be very clear, okay? In order to resolve this contradiction in the Mishnah, between the Mishnah and Rabbi Yosi Aglili, instead of suggesting, which was one possibility, well, it's just a machloket. One thinks it's mamon ba'alim and one thinks it's mamon gavoa, which means it belongs to God. Now, you could say Rabbi Yosi Aglili thought that it depends on what stage. When you designate it to be a sacrifice, it's still your own. But once it's sacrificed, it's no longer your own. The Gemara wanted to ask now, and I want to clarify the question, say it a little better than I did yesterday. The Gemara, when it says, Umechayim mi amar, they want to suggest now, maybe Rabbi Yosi Aglili didn't even think that that's okay. Now, what this is suggesting is that maybe Rabbi Yosi Aglili is much more limited. And limiting in what way? So again, let's go back to what we said. Let's kind of read the sugya and then understand the question better. The next section, basically, in order to raise this question, brings another Mishnah that said that a bechor, you can sell it, whether it's, right, a perfectly good animal ready to be sacrificed when it's alive, a balmum when it's alive or slaughtered, and you can use it to betroth a woman, meaning it's yours. You can sell it, you can betroth a woman with it. It belongs to you. Now, the key here is not the Mishnah, it's what Rav Nachman did to the Mishnah. Rav Nachman said this Mishnah is only a bechor nowadays when we have no temple. But of course, in the time of the temple, you can't use, now notice what they're talking about. You can't sell a bechor when it's still alive if it can be sacrificed. That's basically what Rav Nachman's saying. Now, then Rava said, wait, what are you talking about? Rabbi Yosi Aglili says, kodshim kalim or mamon ba'alim. If, right, bechor is kodshim kalim, it's light kedusha, because at the end, the kohen who gets the bechor is allowed to eat it. And if Rabbi Yosi Aglili says it's your own, and this Mishnah, the way Rav Nachman understood it, is saying when it can be sacrificed, it's not your own, Comes Ravina and he says, and now this is what's important, Ravina limits Rabbi Yosi Aglili entirely in order to resolve this contradiction. What does he say? Oh, when Rabbi Yosi Aglili said what he said, now here we get to the key point. He wasn't talking about after it's slaughtered, of course not. He wasn't talking about before it's slaughtered, if I take it for a sacrifice. He was talking about in a case where I'm actually not obligated to sacrifice it. What would that be? Bechor b'chutz la'aretz. Okay, if I lived abroad and I was a Kohen and someone gave me a bechor, I don't, according to Rabbi Shimon, remember, I don't have an obligation to bring it to the temple. If I happen to go to Israel and I bring it with me, then I have to bring it. But if I stay home and I don't bring my animal with me to Israel, I don't have to sacrifice this animal. That's when Rabbi Yosi Aglili said kodshim kalim are owned by the owner. It's in that case. Now, again, let's go back to our timeline. I designated the animal, right? And then I slaughtered it. So originally the Gemara said, only when you slaughter it does Rabbi Yosi Aglili stop, right? And he thinks, oh, at that point it's mamon gava. But when I designated it for a sacrifice, it's my own. But according to Ravina, no. Rabbi Yosi Aglili is only talking about if I can't sacrifice it at all, because it's a bechor outside of Israel. And what didn't he say? He could have easily said, if it's really true that I take, let's say, a korban shlamim or a bechor, and I can sacrifice it in Israel. I could sacrifice it, and it's still mine, and I could still betroth a woman with it or do whatever, or sell it if I want. Then he should have simply said, oh, you have a problem with this Mishna, and the fact that Rabbi Natan said that can only be when you can't sacrifice it, that's the rabbis, and this is Rabbi Yosi Aglili. The fact that he doesn't say that, he seems to come to the conclusion that Ravina thinks that Rabbi Yosi Aglili is only talking about a case where it's not to be sacrificed, which means that Mechaim, and of course, La'achar Shchita, it's not Mamon Ba'alim anymore. Okay, so again, first we said maybe only after Shchita he thinks it's not owned by the owners anymore. We're basically, as we go along this sugya, we seem to be limiting Rabbi Yosi Aglili. We thought in the beginning, and not because just we thought it, Rabbi Yochanan said it. The nechasim she'en be'milah, all of kodshim kalim are included here because, right, they're considered your mamon. And he quoted Rabbi Yosi Aglili as saying it very simply. But then to resolve the first contradiction, we limit it to after shchita. Now, based on this contradiction, we're going to limit even to before shchita, and we're going to say that Rabbi Yosi Aglili, when he said kodshim kalim belong to the owner, it's only in a case of bechor and chutz la'aretz, where you don't have to sacrifice it. Okay, that's what he would say. So now the Gemara is going to reject that. Okay, that's what we got to yesterday. So now Amarle, from the top of our daf, and this I added now a last part to the chart, which is matnot kuna kamalta. Wait a minute. This whole reason you were trying to say that Rabbi Yosi Aglili doesn't think that an animal that can be sacrificed is really called the owned by the owner. It's really mamon gavoa. You thought that. Well, the example you brought was bechor. Bechor is different. This whole thing, right? The whole problem with this Mishna and what Rabbi Natan said about the Mishna was all about a firstborn. Firstborn animals are totally different. They have a different law than, for example, shlamim, which was our basic example, a peace offering. Why? When you give a gift to a kohen, now we're going to basically say the following. The Mishnah was talking about a special din for bechor. When the Braita said, to include kodshim, which are the owner, it's owned by the person, that's all the rest of kodshim. In other words, that's things that are not bechor. Why is bechor different? Because bechor was given as a gift to the kohanim. It wasn't theirs to begin with, right? It was my firstborn animal that I gave to a kohen. Why did the kohanim get it? Because they're representatives of God. Basically, what God is saying is, I'm giving you from mine, okay? So that's something that is more sanctified than a shlam. And therefore, don't question me from that. So we're back to what we thought before, which is Rabbi Yosi Aglili thinks that all kodshim kalim belong to the owner, even if they're going to be sacrificed. And then, depending on how you resolve that first contradiction from the first Mishnah we brought, either you say it applies across the board, or you say it applies only before you slaughter it. Once you slaughter it, there is an opinion that says even Rabbi Yosi Aglili will think it's no longer owned by you. Yes, you get to eat it, but it already, because you sacrificed it, it becomes kind of the property of God that God is allowing you to eat. Okay? And that's different from bechor. Bechor, at least right now, according to this answer, we're going to see the bechor is more likely has more sanctity, and more sanctity is equated with maybe it's not mamon ba'alim. Okay, maybe it doesn't belong to the owner unless it's, for example, in chutz la'aretz or when there's no longer a temple. Okay, that was what we saw in the sugya. Now we're going to go more in depth, and we're going to see that even though Rabbi Yosi said it by kodshim kalim, and we thought he meant all kodshim kalim, we already saw maybe it's limited and not bechor. Now we're going to see maybe it's limited even more. So let's see. We're going to see a few different opinions here. That's a quote from the Bright. Ben Azai Omer. Now we're going to have two versions of Ben Azai. We're going to have the first one is quoted by Ben Azai. The second one is someone else who says, I heard Ben Azai say the following. And they're going to each say different things. And then we're going to have two versions of what each side means here. So it's going to be a little confusing, but again, we'll look at the chart and that will help. Ben Azai Omer lerabot et hashlamim. That comes to include shlamim. Now, if you're including something, it must be excluding something else. So we're going to say if it includes shlamim, what does it exclude? So again, the three things we're going to be discussing are shlamim, bechor, and maaser. Rabbi Yosi ben Dostai Omer, lo amar ben Azai ela bebechor bilvad. When Ben Azai said what he said, meaning Ben Azai was explaining Rabbi Yosi clearly which kodshim kalim are considered owned by the owner, he only meant bechor. Okay, the firstborn, not what we're going to have to see. So now we don't really understand this yet. We're going to give two different interpretations of what this means. Amar, and I'll pull up the chart again. We'll follow in the chart. So this is just the machloket of what Ben Azai, what Rabbi Yosi clearly says. Ben Azai says the rabot hashlamim. Rabbi Yosi ben Dostai says just bechor. So Amar Ben Azai Omer lerabot et hashlamim lemiute mai. What is this coming to exclude? Because if it says this includes shlamim, it must mean, but it doesn't include something else. Lemiute mai ilema lemiute bechor. Now we have to bring logic. What if you're going to say shlamim is owned by the owner? Would it be obvious that also bechor, or would it be the reverse? Now, from the previous sugya, what would you say? Just because shlamim is owned by the owner doesn't mean bechor is, because what did we say? Bechor is according to the previous answer, right? The beginning of our daf, the Gemara there didn't say why. Soon we'll see why, but thought that obvious bechor is more likely owned by God and not by the owner. So if you say lerabot et hashlamim, now they're going to say the opposite logic. If you're going to say it excludes bechor, which based on the previous sugya, we would say that shlamim is mamon ba'alim, bechor is not. It can't be, because they bring opposite logic. What's their logic? If shlamim is owned by the owner and not considered sanctified to God, right, that it's owned by God, then obviously bechor is not going to be owned by God either. Why is that? Hashta, like I said, this is the opposite of what we said earlier. Hashta umashlamim shetunim smicha unisachim uchnufat chazev shok. There's all sorts of laws about a shlamim. I bring a peace offering. I have to lean on the animal, right? The owner has to do this leaning process before we slaughter. I have to bring these libations that go along with the sacrifice. I have to wave the chazev shok, okay, the breast and the thigh. These are all unique laws by a shlamim that do not exist by bechor. Bechor, you bring it, you slaughter it, you sacrifice it, period. So if this has all sorts of extra laws about it, and yet amart mamon ba'alimu, and yet even though it's kind of more sanctified, it's still considered owned by the owners. Bechor mebaya, of course a bechor will be. So therefore, right now we're going to assume when it says lerabot et hashlamim, it means bechor and shlamim or mamon ba'alim. What's it coming to exclude? Ela amar Rabbi Yochanan lemiute maaser. It's coming to say the 10th animal that you give to the kohen, and he's supposed to sacrifice it. That 10th animal is what is excluded here. That is considered mamon gavoa. That's considered owned by God. Kiditanya. How do we know that there's a difference? Now we want to set up that there's a difference between bechor and maaser. We're going to quote this Braita. Bechor ne'emar lo tifdeh. Okay, this means you can't redeem a firstborn. If it's a firstborn, it has to be brought as a sacrifice. You can't redeem it and use a different animal instead. Vinimkal. Okay, so now even though it's lo tifdeh, that animal is sanctified. The law is, this Braita states, nimkar tam chai ubal mum chai v'shachut. Okay, it can be sold if it's right going to go on the altar when it's still alive. You can sell it. If it's a bal mum, if it's blemished, this is what we saw before. You can sell it chai and shachut, whether it's alive or slaughtered. But b'maaser ne'emal lo yigael. Maaser, okay, so here it says lo tifdeh, don't redeem, but it's still your own that you can sell it. You just can't take the sanctity off of it, right? When you sell it with its sanctity. But by the way, by who you're selling bechor to, you're selling it to a fellow Kohen who can then bring it as a sacrifice. But b'maaser, by the 10th animal, it says lo yigael, it cannot be redeemed. Ve'eino nimkar lo chai v'lo shachut lo tam v'lo ba'al mum. You cannot sell it at all. So what do you see from here? As we said, bechor and shlamim, presumably, right? Because that's what he said. L'rabot shlamim. Shlamim and bechor are considered the mamon of the owner. But maaser is on a higher level, because if you can't sell maaser, that's your proof that it's not your own. Okay? That's the whole thing. If it's your own, you can sell it. Or for our purposes, right, you'll be liable for damages. If it's not your own, you can't sell it, you can't patrol the woman with it, and you won't be liable for damages. So according to the first reading of Ben Azai, when Ben Azai says l'rabot shlamim, he means shlamim and obviously bechor are mamon ba'alim, but not maaser. And then, okay, now the Gemara doesn't say this, but then what's the obvious? When Rabbi Yosi ben Dostai says lo amar Ben Azai ela bechor bilvad, it makes perfect sense, because Ben Azai, the first reading was bechor and shlamim are mamon ba'alim, and comes Rabbi Yosi and he says no, just bechor, maaser and shlamim are not. Okay, and that makes sense according to this logic. Maaser, because we saw that braita, that it's in a higher level of sanctity, and shlamim, because it has nisachim, and it has smicha, and it has all those extra things. So it's a higher level of sanctity, so they're not mamon ba'alim. Okay, that's different understandings of Rabbi Yosi. Now we're going to get to Ravina. Ravina matne la sefa. Ravina brought this braita that we just showed, differentiating between bechor and maaser, dafka on the second part, on Rabbi Yosi ben Dostai. And now we're going to read it like this. Rabbi Yosi ben Dostai, we're going to have a totally different reading. Lo amar ben Azai ela bechor bilvad. And then the whole discussion, not even just the braita, but the whole discussion, the mi'utei mai, was on Rabbi Dostai. When he said only bechor, now it's a little bit strange. He says only bechor, but now they're going to assume he doesn't mean only bechor. Okay? His interpretation is going to match what we thought Ben Azai said in the first interpretation, which is and now he's going to have the exact opposite logic that we had before. If you're going to say he's trying to exclude shlamim, which is what we thought he was saying, because he said only bechor is mamon ba'alim, but shlamim is not, that makes no sense. It's counterintuitive. Because, and this goes back to the first sugya we saw today, ma bechor shekadosh mirechem. Now we finally get the answer. Why it's more likely that bechor is going to be considered the property of the owner. The property of God. Why is that? Because as opposed to shlamim, I took a random animal on the street, and I decided it was going to be sanctified. That's not as strong as this bechor that was born. My firstborn animal is born with sanctity. It has inherent sanctity. Not only that, before it was born, it had sanctity to it, right? Merechem. When it was in utero, it was the firstborn animal to this mother. It is now going to be sanctified from the beginning. So that would be much more logical to say that belongs to God. And if Rabbi Abba Yosi ben Dostai thinks that Ben Azai held bechor is mamon ba'alim, of course he's going to say shlamim is. Okay, so that's the opposite logic. So shlamim mibaya, he doesn't even need to say it. It's obvious that shlamim is going to be owned by the owner because it wasn't even sanctified from the beginning. So of course it has less sanctity. So if bechor is going to be considered owned by the owner, then of course so is shlamim. So now, what's it coming to exclude then? And again, this is the exact sugya we just saw, but instead of saying it on Ben Azai, we're saying it on Rabbi Dostai's reading of Ben Azai. Amar Rabbi Yochanan lemi'utei maaser. Kidetanya, as it says in this braita, bechor ne'emar lo tivdev v'nimkar tam chai u'ba'al mum v'shachut. B'maaser ne'emar lo yigael ve'eino nimkar chai v'lo shachut lo tam v'lo ba'al mum. Remember, this is the differentiation. Neither can be redeemed. However, bechor can be sold to a fellow Kohen, whereas maaser cannot be sold, right? Depending on the situation, but without getting into all the details, the point is maaser clearly is, if more likely to say, it belongs to God, and therefore that's what he's coming to exclude. To which so now let's just go back, and before we get to the question of the Gemara, which is kind of an obvious question, but when Rabbi Yosi ben Dostai said, Ben Azai said only bechor, what he meant is only bechor and shlamim, because if bechor, then obviously shlamim is going to be considered owned by the owner, based on the fact that the bechor has more sanctity because it was sanctified from the beginning. He's ignoring this part about the smicha and nisachim, all that. And maaser is the one excluded, which means that by default, when Ben Azai says l'rabot shlamim, what does he mean? He means only shlamim, okay? only shlamim, when he says that the Rabbi Yosi Galili says, l'rabo kodshim kalim, he means specifically to include shlamim and nothing else. And maaser and bechor are going to be considered mamon gavoa. That's what we would have to say. To which the Gemara asks the obvious question, which is, this doesn't match the words, because look at the wording. According to Rabbi Yosi ben Chalafi, he said, Lo Rabbi Azai ela bebechor bilvad, only. Ha-bechor bilvad kamar. He said, only bechor. How can you possibly explain that it's also shlamim? Kasha, to which they say, you're right. That does raise a good question against Ravina's theory. Okay, so Ravina, we end with a bit of a question that this doesn't really match the wording. Okay, but we had two explanations. Again, either which way, we're going to have two opinions. One is going to say, Maaser is mamon gavoa, and one is going to say, or Maaser and shlamim are mamon gavoa. And it's either only bechor or bechor and shlamim are mamon ba'alim. And it just depends, it's a matter of who said what. Okay, and both are really different interpretations of what Ben Azai said in the first place. It's just a matter of which one was quoted to us by Ben Azai and which one was in Rabbi Yosi's name. Rava Amam. Now we're going to go back to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah had said, Nechasim that don't have meila, you have to pay damages for, which meant don't have meila, it meant hedyo, regular things, and it meant kodshim kalim, which now we have a debate which kodshim kalim. Shlamim and bechor, just bechor, okay, different interpretations of what that is. Rava has a whole different interpretation of the Mishnah. My nechasim she'en behem meila, nechasim she'en behem din meila. They don't have laws of meila. What does that mean? Dehedyo. Basically, Rava says, no, don't get too nitpicky of this Mishnah. Oh, this is Rabbi Yosi Aglili who said kodshim kalim. No. Kodshim kalim, forget this whole kodshim kalim or mamon ba'alim, and therefore you're responsible. No. This Mishnah is like the rabbis. Or maybe some other interpretation of Rabbi Yosi Aglili, the way they tried to explain. Maybe Rabbi Yosi Aglili is talking about when it's bechor outside of Israel or something. But our Mishnah is just saying anything sanctified, if there's a sanctified shore, you're not liable, okay, at all. Anything, whether it's kodshim kalim, anything. Right? So the Gemara says, well, then it should have just said, why did it pick this weird language? She'ein behem meila. It should have just said, nechasim shel hedyo. And then we would have known that it doesn't include kodshim, it doesn't include kodshim kalim. So again, kasha. So this reading of Rava is difficult because it should have been more clear in the Mishnah. The fact that it took a complicated way to say something simple and didn't take the simple way maybe means it really isn't the simple way. I'm a Rabbi Abba. Now going back to Rabbi Yosi Aglili. If we take Rabbi Yosi Aglili, that mamon ba'alim, right? Shlamim, let's say. Shlamim is mamon ba'alim. If your shore is a shore of shlamim and it gores someone, you have to pay. Before we get to this, I want to introduce a different machloket that's going to come up here. Okay, let's go back to Ruth and Naomi's shore and Yael. Okay, we have three people, Ruth, Naomi, Yael. Ruth has an ox, so does Naomi. Ruth's ox gores Naomi's ox, so it's a shore, right? It's a keren damage. Keren damages could end up in, right, could be Ruth's shore is a short time, only half damages. She damages Naomi's ox, so pushes the ox. But what happens to Naomi's ox? Well, the ox pushes the other ox, and right there is a bore that Yael dug. So Naomi's ox falls into, after being pushed by Ruth's ox, falls into Yael's bore. And now she has damages. And now what are the damages from? Well, they're also from the shore and also from the bore. As a machloket chachamim and Rabbi Natan, what happens here? Who pays? What's the responsibility? So chachamim say Ruth pays. Okay, just Ruth. It has nothing to do with the bore, because if she hadn't been pushed, she wouldn't have fallen in the bore. So it's Ruth's ox's responsibility entirely. So Ruth has to pay the full damages, or if it's Karen, she only pays half damages. Okay. So let's say the damage is 200. So Ruth will pay 100 if it's half damages, and she'll lose the other 100. Okay, Naomi, she won't get it. But comes Rabbi Natan and says, what are you talking about? If Ruth only pays half damages, 100, then, or let's say even she pays full damages, Ruth can claim, I don't have to pay full damages. I shared the damage. It wouldn't have been damaged as much were it not for the bore. So Yael and I are going to share the responsibility. Okay, so let's take a case where it's a shore mu'ad, meaning Ruth has to pay full damages, but also Yael has to pay full damages because bore always pays full damages. So they're going to split it 50-50. Each one will pay 100. That's a simple case. But here comes the complicated part. If it was a short time and Ruth only has to pay half the damage, okay? So she pays half. Now, what does she pay half of? Well, half of her share. If it was full damage, she'd only have to pay 100 because it was her and Yael together who have to pay. So she only has to pay half of 100, which is 50. Now, comes Naomi and says, what's going on here? I'm getting 150. That doesn't make any sense. Because if it weren't for Ruth and it was just Yael's bore, I would have gotten full damages. So Ruth, we can't make her pay more than her 50%. But since Naomi could have paid full, Yael could have paid full because she's Baal HaBor. The Baal HaBor needs to compensate for the fact that it was a short time. Short time is irrelevant because in the end, it fell into a bore. She has to put in the end, Yael is going to have to pay 75% and Ruth is going to pay only 25%. And Naomi is going to get her full amount, but 75% from the Baal HaBor and 25% from Ruth, from the Baal HaShor. So that's a machloka that we're going to get to later. We'll understand it even better when we see it again, but that's the basis for what we're going to get into now. You'll see, you'll think, why is this connected? In a minute, you'll see. I'm a Rabbi Abba. They're going to try to say it's connected. In the end, they're going to say it's not connected. It's totally different. So if you think it's not so connected, don't worry. The Gemara is going to reject the connection. Shlamim shiziku, govem ibsaram ve'eno govem imurehen. If an animal that's a korban shlamim, right? So it's an animal I designate for a korban shlamim, and then the animal gored someone, and then I brought it as a sacrifice. So when we pay, remember, you pay from the animal itself, you pay from the meat, but not from the parts that go on the altar, because those get burnt and those belong to God. To which the Gemara says, Pshita, that's a very obvious halacha. Imurim legavah salke. Of course, you're not going to pay from the imurim. They go up to God. Of course, there's no way you would pay damages from that. Lo tzricha, what it's meant for is legovemi bsaran keneged imurim. Now, here we get to the Baal HaBor and the Baal HaShor. Just like Yael had to fill in the 75%. So let's take a shore. It's worth 200. The shore gored someone else, and it was a shore of shlamim. Now, let's assume the imurim are a smaller percentage than the meat. So let's say the meat is worth 150 and the imurim are worth 50. Well, since we only collect from the meat, if it was a short time, we're going to do half damages. Half of 150, we're only going to assess it by the amount of what the shore is worth. In other words, yes, he gored an ox worth 200. So he really owes 100. But what? Or let's say it's Ruth's ox. Ruth owes 100 now. But since the imurim are worth 50, we have to deduct that. And when we calculate how much Ruth has to pay, she only has to pay half the value of her animal. So half the value of her animal now is 150, which is 75. So she only has to pay 75. And you might have thought that what? Well, since the animal was complete at some point and it had the imurim as part of the animal and it damaged, maybe even though you can't collect from the 50, you can fill in that 50, the missing 25 to get to 100 from the meat itself. That's the question. And that's what it's telling you. You're not goveb saran kineged imurim. Ruth only has to pay 75. She doesn't say, oh, I have to fill in the extra 25 that should have been from the imurim, but I can't pay an imurim because, again, imurim is 50, so half of that is 25. So maybe I should take meat and fill in that missing 25. No, she doesn't. Okay, so now they say aliba deman. Who does this go like? And back to this machlok at the rabbis and Rabbi Natan about the filling in. Now, remember, the rabbi said there is no filling in because the Baal HaBor is exempt. So, pshita. Of course, she doesn't need to fill in for the imurim. The imurim are like the Baal HaBor. The Baal HaBor has nothing to do with it. We're only making the Baal HaShor responsible, Ruth's ox who gored, even though it fell into the pit. Here also, we're only making the meat obligated and not the imurim. So pshita, then it would be obvious. You wouldn't need to tell us this. And ha'amre, when you don't have to pay from there, you don't fill in with the other. Rabbi Natan, ha'amar, if it's Rabbi Natan, he actually says, you do fill in. The Baal HaBor fills in the missing. So we should take the meat to fill in the missing imurim. And then you would have to pay, and this is not what it says here. So if we go like the rabbis, it's obvious. If we go like Rabbi Natan, it's not true. And that's what it said here isn't true. You would have to fill in, and here it says you don't. So now they're going to say, Ibai Dama Rabbi Natan, Ibai Dama Rabbanan. We can now explain it according to both because the cases are very different. Ibai Dama Rabbanan, you could say, Hanimili Betray Gufe. That's two different things. There's a shore and there's a bor. Those are two totally separate things. If we say the Baal HaBor is patur, of course, he doesn't have to pay the extra damages. But this was one animal that was made up of meat and imurim, right? The parts that get burnt. So that's one animal. Of course, you can make potentially one pay for the other, in which case, right? You owe 100, take it from any part of the animal. So fine, you can't pay from the imurim, pay for the rest. And therefore, it wasn't pshita, it wasn't obvious that you don't. And that's why it told us, well, you might have thought that you can fill in the 100 from an extra 25 of meat. No, you don't. Because really, the imurim part is exempt, and that whole part is exempt, and you only pay the 75, half of what the meat is worth. So it wasn't obvious. It is the halacha, but it wasn't obvious. Now they're going to say, Rabbi Natan. Also, we explained according to Rabbi Natan how. So, the Baal Ashur could say to the Baal Abor, Ruth could say to Yael, I don't have to pay anymore because you should fill in. Why? Because my mistake. Naomi, who's now theoretically is only going to get 25% from Ruth and only 50% from the Baal, from Yael, the owner of the boar, and she's going to be at a loss of 25%, right? 25%. She can go to Yael and say, listen, pay up, because in the end, I found my shore in the bottom of your pit. So pay up the full damages, right? Now, you don't have to pay full, but 75%, because in the end, I found my shore there. If I can't get it from Ruth because she already paid her half damages and it doesn't cover the whole damage that I incurred, the whole loss, at least you should pay it because you're in general obligated for full damages. So you have to fill in because in the end I found the shore in your pit. Moving now to Amabet, min matzei amar basar azik imurim lo azik, but it's not like the imurim could say, listen, we didn't, right? One could say, we didn't damage, we did damage. It's not like the shore is split into two parts, like a shore and a boar. This is totally a ridiculous comparison, because it's not like we could say, oh, there was one part that damaged this and one part that damaged that. The basar and the imurim were all one of the same when the shore was alive. So this is not a good comparison at all. And therefore, you could also explain, according to Rabbi Natan, in this case, where in that case, the Baal Abor can be mashlim. In this case, you don't need to take the meat and be mashlim for the imurim. It's not a fair comparison. So that's and yet it was, I see your question, Becky. It's a short time that we're talking about because that's the case where damages are missing. If it was a shor mu'ad, there wouldn't be damages missing at all because you would pay the full amount. The truth is, in a shor mu'ad, you would pay 150, but I think they would assume that was whole. Yeah, they don't seem to be talking about a shor mu'ad case in this case. Okay, Amar Rava, moving on. Another case, we're still in this topic of kodshim kalim and cases where a shor that was already designated for a sacrifice could have gored someone else. You have to pay damages. So now, and again, what did we learn? You pay. This is why it's only in a short time. This is the big difference. We're going to get there. We didn't see this yet. Only in a short time you pay from the animal itself. That's why it's only a discussion in a short time, in answer to your question. A shor muad, you would pay the value from anything you own. Here, you only pay the value of the animal itself. So again, we evaluate this animal only from the basar, not the imurim. That's the whole chidush, because the imurim we just ignore because they're not really owned by the owner. So now, a toda shezika. Let's say you have a korban toda. Korban toda works like this. It's a Thanksgiving offering. It's a type of shlamim, so it's kodshim kalim. You bring out an animal, and with it, you bring 40 loaves of bread. And you have to bring the 40 loaves with the animal. So if you have a toda shezika, you have an animal that, let's say, Ruth designated for a korban toda, and then her animal gored Naomi, she has to pay from the animal. Gove mi b'sara ve'ino gove mi lachma. Well, she takes the money, right? She pays Naomi from the animal, not from the breads, to which the Gemara says, lechem pshita, what? Why would you even think to take from the breads? The breads didn't cause the damage. It was the animal. To which they say, you're right. It's obvious. They don't need to say it, but the reason why they mentioned the breads was for the next part. Seifa itzri chalei. It's for the next part of what he said. Nizak ochel basal umitkaper mevi lechem. What happens in this case? So Naomi gets the meat, and she gets to eat the meat because her ox was damaged by this one. But mitkaper mevi lechem. But Ruth brings the bread. She has to bring the bread offering. So they say hanami pshita. Well, that's also obvious. So they say Ma'u detema kevan de lechem hechsheret dezevaku lemalei atachal basar va'anai telechem. If the lechem is only really a hechsher for the zebach, meaning you can't eat the meat until you bring the bread. So Ruth could say, listen, you're eating the meat. I don't need to bring the bread. You want to eat the meat? Bring the bread with it. No, she can't do that because the lechem is obviously an obligation on the owner and not an obligation. But it'd be a funny thing. Naomi would get this payment of the animal, and then she'd have to pay all this money out to buy the breads. So that would be strange. And obviously it also doesn't make sense because it's an obligation, even though Ruth in the end is not going to eat the animal, but she does have to bring the breads. Okay, now we're moving on in the Mishnah. There's more cases in the Mishnah that we have to pay damages for. That means people who are part of the covenant. That means Jews. So what's this coming to exclude? It's obvious what it says, excluding. Well, if you want to say it means that if Ruth's ox gores Gentile's ox, she's not obligated to pay damages. Well, even though that seems quite difficult, we're not going to make them obligated to pay damages. We're going to push up the sugya till we learn it, and now we're going to see that it's going to come up later. Well, hakatane lala kaman, it actually appears in the Mishnah later on. If a Jew's ox gores a Gentile's ox, patur, you're exempt. So why would it be saying in this Mishnah as well? It comes up later in the Masechet. We're going to see it on Lamed Zayin. To which the answer, Tana Bahadr Mefarish. No, it actually is repeated. Here, they kind of set it out, and that's why we're not going into it, because later it's going to explain it much better. Okay, so this is just kind of general rules that we're going to get into later. They're going to come back to this kind of answer also coming up. Nechasim hamiyuchadim. This was the next case in the Mishnah. What is nechasim hamiyuchadim? So we're going to have a few explanations. What's it coming to exclude? Amar Rabbi Yehuda, nechasim hamiyuchadim means ones that are specified. So what does it mean specified? If Naomi's ox gets gored by some ox, but we don't know whose it is. Was it Ruth's ox or was it Yael's ox? So then she can't collect damages because it's not clear. It has to be in the Chasim HaMiyuchadim, where it's specified exactly, we know whose it is. But if we say it's that, it also appears in the Mishnah later. If two oxen were chasing one, if Ruth claims, oh, it was Yael's shore, and Yael claims it was Ruth's shore, then nobody is obligated. So if that's what our Mishnah is saying, it already says it later, to which the Gemara says again, Tane Bahadr Mefarish. Now, here it set it up as the general, and there it got into more detail about it. But that was one interpretation, the Chasim Yuchadim. Now we're going to have a second interpretation, which is going to split into a few different options. B'manita Tana, in a bright that says prat l'nichsei hefker. It's to say ownerless. Okay, if it's ownerless, then there's no damages. So now what's ownerless? The one who got gored or the one who gored? So hechidami, what's the case? If it's Ruth's ox gored an ownerless ox, well, mantavale, there's no question. Of course, nobody in this Mishnah doesn't need to tell you Ruth is exempt. Who's she supposed to pay? It doesn't have an owner. What if a hefker, an ownerless ox, gored Naomi's ox? So then, lezavalete. Well, there, it's actually not. Why would you say there's no damages? Because, think about it. What did we learn? Naomi can collect it from the shore itself. So even if the shore is ownerless, this shore caused her a loss of her shore, she could just take the shore and keep it. It's ownerless anyway, so let her just take it, which means she could get paid damages from it. So what must be the case? It's a case where some random ox gored Naomi's ox. She can't collect damages when? If someone decided a minute later or before she gets to take the shore herself, someone says, oh, it's ownerless, I'm going to take the shore to be my own. Now, Naomi can't go collecting damages from the owner now, okay, because it was ownerless at the time. Ravina has a different explanation. Ravina amar lemiute nagach v'achar kach hikdish, nagach v'achar kach hifkir. What if it was Ruth's animal? And after, okay, this nechasim yuchadim means if it was Ruth's animal that gored Naomi's animal, and then Ruth said, oh, you know what, I'm sanctifying this animal, or I'm making it ownerless. Then Naomi can't collect from her. Now, this seems strange, but we're going to learn it from a pasuk now. Tanya nami hachi, there's a brighter to support this reading, because yeter ken amar Rabbi Yehuda, in addition, Rabbi Yehuda said, afilu nagach b'achar kach hikdish, nagach b'achar kach hifkir patur. Okay, Ruth can exempt herself in that way. Shenemar. How do we know this? Because it says V'hu'ah beba'alav v'hemit ish. Okay, this is when it's talking about if a shor was a shor mu'ad, and it says V'hu'ah beba'alav v'hemit ish. Hu'ah beba'alav means they testified against him in court. That's what we're going to call in a minute ha'amada b'din. You got taken to trial, and hemit ish was what he did. Right, he killed someone. That actually happened before. So because these appear right next to each other in the pasuk, ajite mitav amada b'din shavim ke'echad. It has to be in the same, well, Rashi is going to say the same owner, both when it killed and when it stood up to court. So if Ruth makes it ownerless, she doesn't have to pay. They say, wait a minute. And by the way, Rashi says, it sounds like it has to have one owner the whole time. The Rashba says, based on some other sugya, no, it has to just not be ownerless later. If Ruth sold it to someone in the interim before Hamada B'din, that person would also have to still pay it. It's only if she made it ownerless. So there's a bit of an issue with Rashi here. But anyway, we'll keep on. Then they say, but if you're already learning it from that pasuk, it's not just during the time the shor killed and the time that you put him up to court, but hashashor yisakel bigmardinu dichtiv. In that pasuk, it also says the shor will get stoned, which means also after the court decided. So elaema, it must mean ajte mita hamadabadin ugmardin. All shavin ke'echad. You have to have, again, either the same owner or at least it has to have an owner, that whole process. If you made it ownerless at some point, then you'll be exempt. So there were two explanations to what it means ownerless, in addition to the other explanation. And the chasim and yuchadim could even be a case where there was a fight over who was the one who shor gored. Okay. Now we're going to go on to the next case. This is very simple. If Naomi's animal went into Ruth's field and Ruth's ox gored Naomi's animal, Ruth could say, I'm not paying Damarle, Torach Birshuti, my buy. What was your shor doing in my domain? Okay, not my fault. Rishut Hanizak Bamazik. Okay, now we have to go to this line. I want to look at the Mishna for a minute. The last case in the Mishna is this case, Rishut Hanizak Vahamazik. Okay, which means it's a joint territory. Now, the line before said, except for Rishut HaMiyuchedet Lamazik, and theoretically it could be read as, and except for Rishut Hanizak Vamazik. If it's shared property for both people, you're not liable. But maybe the Rishut HaMazik Vanizak goes with the next line, which is, it doesn't say chutz before. Then the next line is, Kishizik Havamazik L'Shalem Tashlumi Nezik B'Meitav Haaretz. So you could read it as, Rishut HaNizak Vamazik, you're liable, because Kishizik, in that case, you have to pay full damages. So there's two ways to read it. That's what we're going to see right now. If Ruth and Naomi share a property and Ruth's animal eats the part that was Naomi's, or some part of it, she's liable. And this is how you read the Mishnah then. The previous case was you're exempt because Naomi's ox came into Ruth's property. And then you read it, and Rishut Hanizak Vamazik, if it's shared property, Kishizik Chavamazik. And that last line is coming to explain that you're obligated. For Rabbi Elazar, Patur L'Shem Bala Regel, you're exempt because it's shared property. Why should you be liable? And this is how to read it. Chutz Rishut HaMiyuchedet Lamazik, and Rishut Hanizak Vamazik Nami Patur, and even shared property, you'd be exempt. And now, what's this line then coming for? Kishizik Chavamazik. We already knew that from the previous Mishnah. Remember, we already discussed this, that this is an unnecessary line. Latuya Karen, it must be coming to include Karen damages. Now, why would you have to include Karen damages? Because they're not in the 4 Avot Nizikim. Why are they not in the 4 Avot Nizikim? That only works, Hanicha L'Shmuel. That works like Shmuel. Remember, Shmuel said Mav'ez Shein, which means the shor is regel, which means the Karen is missing. This line comes to include Karen. This is a review of a sugya we already saw. If shor includes Shein, Karen, and regel, then you don't need to include Karen, and it's not including, according to this interpretation, the Rishut HaMazik, the shared property, because you're exempt. So what's this line? Chava Mazik la tu yemai. What's it coming to include? To which we're going to answer, and we'll end here, and we'll explain this all better tomorrow. We'll start this last part tomorrow. La tuye hadetanu Rabbanan. It's to come to include another case. According to Rava, and according to this interpretation of Rabbi Elazar, we'll have to explain it like this. Kashizik Chavamazik Lahavi. This is a braita that says Kashizik Chavamazik Lahavi. It's coming to include Shomer Chinam VaShoel Nofsei Sachar VaSocher Shizik Be'ema Berishutam Tam Meshalem Chatzi Nezek Mua Beshalem Nezek Shalem. If I'm a shomer, okay, normally a shomer means I have to make sure to protect your animal that nothing happens to your animal. But if I'm a shomer and I'm watching your animal and your animal damages, I'm also responsible. That's what this line is coming to include. Additional, not only am I shomer to protect your animal, I'm a shomer to protect your animal from damaging someone else. And then, I'm only exempt in what case? If somehow in the middle of the night while I was sleeping, some wall fell down and the animal got out, or robbers came and broke down the door and the animal went out, then I'm not responsible. But if it happened in a way that I could have protected, then I'm responsible for the damages. And that's the unique case that's coming, this line is coming to add. What exactly the case is and how this is going to work, we're going to start from the Amar Mar tomorrow and try to figure out that case. So what we did today was quick review. We started with this Rabbi Yosi Aglili, and did he mean in all cases? What exactly was he referring to? Was he referring to only, right, when you can't even sacrifice the animal, like a bechor in chutz la'aretz? And we always said, no. Bechor is unique. Shlamim is different. Shlamim, even in the time of the temple, is mamon ba'alim, according to Rabbi Yosi Aglili. Then we had a whole debate between Ben Azai. What does he say? Is it shlamim? Is it bechor? Is it, right, which one? And the logic this way, logic that way. Then we had Nechasim she'en be'em meila. Rava had a different explanation. Maybe it even excludes kodshim kalim, that you're not liable for damages, but we kind of said that's difficult to read that way. We talked about this shlamim shiziku that you get from the meat, and you can't use the part of the imurim that you don't have to pay. You really just don't have to pay. You don't fill in from the other. And then we tried to figure out how does that work with Rabbi Natan and rabbis' argument about the shore that falls into a bore, right? A shore that gets pushed in by another shore into a bore. Then, and these are all kind of little things that we're going to learn much more in depth when we get to them. This is a lot of the beginning of this Masechet is mentioning all sorts of things that we're going to understand better as we go along. We talked about the Todashi Zika and the Lechem, that the Lechem is the responsibility of the owner. We talked about the Nechasim B'nei Brit, even though it's mentioned elsewhere, it's mentioned here as well. Nechasim Yuchadim, we had two different interpretations, and within the one saying it's Hefker, we then had two different interpretations, what kind of case of Hefker is it? And then we had this, if the animal goes into your domain, obviously you're not responsible for the damages, and then the joint domain, there were two ways to read it, and then that affected how we read that last line. And is that last line including this case, or is it including some other case? And if it's some other case, what's it including? Based on Shmuel, it'll be Karen. Based on Rav, it would be Shomrim, who's the animal while you're watching it damages, and we'll understand that better in tomorrow's class. Wishing everybody a good day and hoping for good news.